Welcome to episode 229 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to review this album by Whitesnake, their first proper full-length LP from 1978, Trouble. What I've got here is a re-release, well actually it's a fairly early re-release, it is pretty close to an original pressing but not quite, on Fame Records, which was an EMI subsidiary. Whitesnake, of course, these days are known for their hair metal excesses of the 1980s when they were all over the radio and all over MTV with a whole string of bombastic hits until grunge comes along and just washes all that away. This is from a different time, much less about arena rock and much more about blues-based boogie rock, and as an album it rocks pretty hard. It's uneven, but generally speaking it's a great introduction to the band's kind of unheralded and unappreciated great run of form in the late 70s, early 1980s. By the end of 1974, Deep Purple were staggering towards the exits as a band, even though they were arguably still making pretty good music. Ian Gillan had left on vocals, and in came David Coverdale in 1973. Then Glenn Hughes comes in on bass, replacing Roger Glover, who'd been fired for reasons he doesn't really quite understand. Both Coverdale and Hughes had musical tastes which of course encompassed hard rock, but also included funk and soul, and these influences were starting to make their way into Deep Purple's music, much to the annoyance of long-standing guitarist Ritchie Blackmore. Now, admittedly, it didn't take much to annoy Ritchie Blackmore. Many people and many objects annoyed Ritchie Blackmore famously over many years in the 1970s. He eventually leaves in 1975 in a huff to go and form Rainbow. Instead of splitting up, Deep Purple soldiers on, and they reach out and bring in former James Gang guitarist Tommy Bolin. That lineup records one last album from the original run of Deep Purple, Come Taste the Band, in 1975, which didn't really please anybody, and so the band splits up in 1975 and does not reform in any way, shape, or form with any lineup until the mid-1980s. The singer, David Coverdale, decides initially to strike out in a solo career rather than form another band. However, the same kinds of issues which had plagued Deep Purple at the end, namely an awkward fit between hard rock and funk and soul, also characterized Coverdale's early solo efforts. There wasn't much market for hard rock fused with funk and soul, or at least there wasn't then. Coverdale had married a woman from Germany in 1974, and after Purple split up, they decided to move to Germany, in part to let Coverdale gather his thoughts and plan his next move. And there he hooks up with an old friend from the northeast of England, the guitarist Micky Moody. Coverdale had known Moody since their days as young musicians, school-age musicians actually, in Middlesbrough in the northeast of England. And another person who was part of their set at the time was Paul Rodgers, who of course would go on to be the lead singer of Free and Bad Company. Paul Rodgers and Moody were in a band called the Wildflowers, and they moved down to London, as most bands from the Northeast tended to do. They tried to establish themselves in London with the Wildflowers. They also met a young guitarist by the name of Paul Kossoff. Moody eventually decides to move back to Middlesbrough to study classical guitar, leaving Rodgers and Kossoff in London. They go on to form Free, and the rest is history. Moody went his own way in music, with not too much success, and he ends up hooking up again with Coverdale in Germany in 1975. They rediscovered the musical affinity they'd had when they were younger, began to write songs together, and were both determined, Coverdale in particular, not to become just a Deep Purple tribute act, but to make a distinct musical statement. And that meant, in part, trying to find a way to blend these funky sounds with these hard rock sounds. They didn't really get it right at first. Coverdale's first solo record, on which Moody played, comes out in 1977, and it's called Whitesnake. And frankly, it's a noble effort, but it's a bit of a downer. It's a bit like Deep Purple meets James Taylor. Coverdale's second solo LP comes out in 1978, North Winds, and this is a more cheerful effort than the first one, but still not that great. The comparison is, I guess, a bit more like, sounds to me like late stage Paul Rodgers and Bad Company, just some sort of C plus B ballads, nothing special, and there's, rock and roll saxophone too. But if the recorded product at this stage wasn't really measuring up, there was a certain amount of chemistry that was beginning to happen with Coverdale and Moody and some of their other players, and Coverdale makes a decision in 1978 to form a band called Whitesnake. Moody, of course, is on board, and they bring in a second guitarist, a guy called Bernie Marsden, who had been playing guitar with another Deep Purple spin-off band, Pace Ashton Lord. Marsden joins the band, despite the fact that he was being wooed by Paul McCartney at that time. He could see that McCartney was on a bit of a downer, Coverdale was on the up, and so he made what I think in retrospect is clearly a smart choice. There was some urgency to all this because Coverdale hadn't been able to tour to support his solo records because of some legal hassles related to the breakup of Deep Purple. Marsden had played in Cozy Powell's group Hammer with another guy, a bass player called Neil Murray, so Murray was brought in through Marsden. The last two initial members brought in were the drummer Duck Dowell and the keyboardist Brian Johnson, and both of those guys had played in a band called Streetwalkers. Johnson himself didn't last long. He was replaced pretty quickly by Pete Solly, who himself wouldn't last long. The band plays their first gig in March 1978 at Lincoln Technical College. They do a small UK club tour and then hunker down in London to start writing songs. Because of Coverdale's pedigree with Deep Purple, EMI had an interest in the band from the very start, but they weren't quite sure they wanted to sign them for a full record deal, so they financed them to make an EP. So they go into Central Recorders studio in London in April 1978 to record this EP, Snakebite. That's released 2 months later, and it's a clear evolution in sound from kind of the wayward sounds of Coverdale's solo records to a much more fully realized blend of the funky and hard rocking sounds that Coverdale had been fumbling towards for a few years. That goes to number 61 on the UK album chart, which in turn gives EMI the confidence to offer Whitesnake a full record deal. So in July 1978, they returned to the same studio to make this record, Trouble. This album's made between July and August 1978 at Central Recorders Studio at number 9 Denmark Street in London. It's produced by Martin Birch. All told, recording and mixing took just 10 days. David Coverdale's on lead vocals. John Lord, who of course was a mainstay of Deep Purple, is on keyboards. Now, of course, Pete Solly had been the keyboardist of choice throughout the spring, but when it came time to make the record, Pace Ashton Lord was breaking up. And this, of course, had been John Lord's post-Purple project. Finding this out, Coverdale gets on the phone and basically lays it on thick to Lord to come into his band and also to come into the studio and to help them make this record. So all of Pete Solly's parts on all of the 10 tracks in this record, which he had laid down, Lord then comes in and redoes all those parts. Solly is basically turned into a non-person. He's not visible anywhere on this record in terms of the credits, and Lord's parts are all there. Now, Lord is not nearly as central to this record as he is to Deep Purple records. You hear solos now and then, but he's not part of the signature sound of Whitesnake. It's very much Coverdale's band in which Lord is playing, which is kind of strange considering the status of the two musicians, but there you go. Micky Moody and Bernie Marsden are both on guitar, both on backing vocals, and Marsden actually sings lead on one track, Free Flight. Neil Murray is on bass guitar, and Duck Dowell is on drums. The album is released in October 1978 and goes to number 50 on the UK albums chart. Side one starts with Take Me With You, and here the gauntlet is thrown down, the sword is drawn from the stone, and Coverdale begins the process of claiming his rightful place as the crown prince of Cockrock. This is a hugely solid piece of boogie rock. It's very funky, but it's also very purplish, not just because of John Lord's contribution, which is excellent, but also because the riffing is very much, actually to my ears, like Flight of the Rat. Another excellent tune follows, which is Love to Keep You Warm. This is brilliantly produced. There's lots of great open spaces in this music. Not the easiest thing to achieve when you've got a six-piece band. Lie Down is next, and here Coverdale's fingers are grasping the scepter of musical virility tighter than ever. The lyrics mean kind of what you might imagine they mean from the title. Not a bad tune, a little bit dated actually these days, I gotta say. Next is a cover of Daytripper. Always tricky to cover the Beatles, but this is actually really well done. It's quite a funky cover. All kinds of reasons on paper not to like this, but actually I think it's great. The only real downer on side one is Nighthawk. Lord actually gets a solo here, which he hadn't really to date. Too bad it was on this clunker. Side two starts with The Time Is Right for Love, which is an upbeat, funky tune, heavily driven by Neil Murray's bass, which is very pleasingly high in the mix. Now we have the title track, which is another great tune, very well arranged, very spacious again. Then we have an instrumental, Belgian Tom's Hat Trick. I think if this were on an Allman Brothers record, people would be praising it to the skies. Free Flight is a tune that Marsden sings on. This is pretty good. There's a lot of decent ideas here, all kind of stitched together in a way that doesn't really come off, I think, the way they intended. The last track on the record is Don't Mess With Me. I don't really think they should have bothered with this. It's just kind of high-tempo filler. This record, I think, confirms what was probably obvious from the dog days of Deep Purple in the mid-70s, which was that at that point, David Coverdale was the only person who had real vision and real ambition. Here, he goes some distance to realizing it. It's full of great vocal performances. It's full of great guitar from both Moody and Marsden. It's very well produced. It's got a lovely, thick bottom end, great sound. The whole record is let down probably too frequently by the songwriting, which is often trying to tie too many disconnected ideas together. There are 6 great tunes here and 3 or 4 mediocre to poor ones. But overall, rock's pretty hard. Coverdale can sing like a hot damn and he can create a mood. For me, this is 3.5 out of 5 stars and a pretty solid start for this band.